In 2007, Gerry McCann spoke to the world, but amidst his words there's a subtle detail, a nearly invisible slip that may reveal more than he ever said directly. Today, we revisit that interview and expose the secret that went unnoticed by almost everyone. Sometimes the truth stumbles and it doesn't fall, it just slips for a second, right there in front of the camera. And when you notice, it's gone. But the lens captured it. The most famous interview in the Madeleine case, Gerry McCann speaks to the world. He takes a deep breath, feigns composure. His eyes try not to wander, but within a single sentence, almost neutral, almost rehearsed, there's a detail, a subtle slip, a word choice that doesn't quite fit, a gesture that doesn't match what's being said. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a journalistic scoop. It was a moment, a second that went unnoticed by almost everyone, except the lens, except those watching now as with sharper eyes. The strangest thing? It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, as if the sentence was veiled, but left a piece of the truth exposed, as if he tried to control it, and stumbled over himself. Most people didn't notice. It was just another interview, just another devastated father trying to explain himself, except it wasn't. In that sentence, in that specific moment, something slips out, something that shouldn't have been said out loud. And what if the lens didn't capture a lie, but the moment it faltered? There's something unsettling there, and it's not just the silence of someone who lost a daughter. It's the lack of disarray, the absence of cracks, as if everything was too polished. You watch, expecting to find pain, but what shows up is control, a cold, trained control, almost immune to chaos. But in the midst of it all, there's a detail, a stumble the body couldn't hide, a piece of what he feels, or tries not to feel, that slipped out before it could be contained. And that's what few saw because they were too busy listening, but not perceiving. Today, we go back to that exact second, to the sentence that wasn't meant to come out that way, to the expression that lasts less than a blink, but leaves a trace. If you feel the same unease, it's because you saw what most missed, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. He walked in front of the cameras with a conviction that felt more like rehearsal. Steady face, controlled tone, almost technical. Gerry McCann seemed more like a spokesperson than a devastated father. And that's exactly where the first whispers of unease began. From the early days, his behavior sparked a subtle strangeness. It wasn't blatant. It was something that nagged without quite knowing why. While the world expected tears, collapse, despair, Gerry offered surgical responses, polished statements, and a presence almost immune to chaos, as if he were wearing a carefully crafted role. And this contrast between what's expected of grief and what's shown in its place planted a silent doubt. What if this control isn't strength, but containment? What if what doesn't leak is exactly what matters most? In one of the first interviews, a journalist asks something simple. Do you believe she's alive? He swallows hard, smiles, and says yes. But there's a moment between the question and the answer, a micro pause, as if his body knew before his mouth what couldn't be said. That kind of pause, it doesn't make headlines, it doesn't become evidence, but it becomes noise. And in the McCann case, that's what there is most. Silences that don't explain, gestures that don't fit, words that feel like prepared lines read in front of a mirror. Around them, everything became a narrative. Posters, press conferences, campaigns, international agendas. Grief became a product, and the parents, its managers. Was it a real effort to find their daughter, a shield, a performance, or all of it together? That's where the conflict begins, between what's felt and what's shown. And when what's shown feels too rehearsed, grief starts to feel like an argument. As weeks passed, this disconnect between grief and discourse only grew. Kate, almost always silent, clutching a teddy bear. Gerry speaking to journalists, shaking hands, giving interviews with rehearsed lines about hope, faith, and cooperation with the police. But you only had to watch the eyes. They didn't always match the words. During a press conference, when asked about the investigation, Gerry hurries to say he's fully cooperating with the Portuguese authorities. But a word slips out. Fully. Was it necessary? Or was it a reinforcement trying to drown out something else? That's when behavioral analyses began. Experts and amateurs started dissecting every McCann gesture. And there was no shortage of things to notice. An automatic touch of the wedding ring, a quick blink at a specific question, a verbal slip here, a memory lapse there. But the most unsettling thing wasn't what appeared. It was what vanished. A document that was on the Judicial Police website and then disappeared. A report that could no longer be accessed. And above all, a question that was never asked forcefully enough. Why so much silence around the parents? No one said the answer, but the behavior suggested Gerry wasn't just a father. He was a communication professional. He knew how to speak. He knew how not to speak. And he knew how to manage his own image, but true grief can't be directed. And in the McCann case, almost nothing leaked, which made every small slip feel bigger, like a loose thread in a well-tailored shirt. If you pull it, it might not stop unraveling. This is the point where the narrative stops being just a search for a child and becomes a theater of silences. The public starts to realize what unsettles us isn't what was said, it's what was never explained. And when that happens, everything changes, because the silence starts making more noise than any words. The scene happens quickly, but those who are attentive feel the impact. Gerry is in front of the cameras, next to Kate. The reporter asks if they have hope of finding their daughter, alive. He listens, breathes, and smiles. But the smile doesn't reach his eyes. And that's exactly where something falters, because the body doesn't lie as easily as the voice. The corner of his mouth curves as if to comfort, but his shoulders drop a millimeter. His fingers holding the microphone tremble, and his gaze, for just a second, drifts in the opposite direction of Kate, as if searching for an answer outside the scene. As if saying unintentionally, "This is just a performance." He responds with conviction, well-chosen words, firm sentences, but the moment between the question and the answer, that's where it all happens. That's where the truth leaks. Maybe you don't notice it the first time, but upon re-watching the clip, the incongruity becomes a silent scream. The rational response clashes with what the body expresses. The rehearsed conviction stumbles into a grief so restrained, almost too restrained, as if it were tucked away where no one could see it, or where no one dared to look. This kind of slip isn't a stumble, it's a crack. And through that crack, something escapes that even they can't control anymore. Kate remains silent, her eyes fixed on something no one sees, her hands in her lap, as if trying to hold onto a part of herself that's slipping away. And the question returns. Did they really believe their daughter was alive? Or were they just playing a role written by others? By the media? By lawyers? By the collateral damage of an unexplained grief? It's strange how sometimes the lie isn't in the wrong words, but in the right words said the wrong way. That moment, however small it seems, became a milestone. Because it wasn't just Gerry who answered. It was his body. It was Kate's silence. It was the failure of grief. Live on air. Analysts who study body language pointed out this kind of micro-expression, the so-called leaks. Small truth. Leaks that the brain can't censor in time. Freud said there are no slips, only truths escaping the prison of consciousness. Nietzsche would go further. He'd say that when you lie out of duty, the body rebels, because the body holds a more primal ethic than any moral code. And Foucault would remind us that every discourse is a bid for power, and every silence is too. In that instant, it all materialized in seconds, a pause, a soulless smile, a misplaced glance, and a response that tried to soothe, but only raised more doubts. Maybe the body said what the mouth rehearsed to hide. And when that happens, everything changes. Because the narrative built with such care, the interviews, the speeches, the campaigns, starts to lose strength. Not for lack of arguments, but for an excess of control. Grief doesn't need choreography, and the absence of spontaneity in this case isn't just a style, it's a question, a wound. It was at this point that the more attentive public began to suspect. Because there's something more unsettling than suffering. It's suffering that seems staged. The doubt didn't come from evidence. It came from pauses, from misplaced smiles, from a silence no one could name, but that weighed heavier than any word. And when silence weighs too much, it stops being absence, it becomes presence. It's strange how certain truths only hurt when they fall into silence. And the most disconcerting thing of all is to think that maybe we'll never know if that silence was guilt, protection, or just a grief no one knew how to live. But there's something in that clip, in that moment, that doesn't fade. No matter how many times we watch it, no matter how many arguments say otherwise, something there doesn't align with love. What started as an almost imperceptible detail in Gerry's interview begins the smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the gaze that flees, the body that trembles a second before speaking, wasn't an isolated case. It was a reflection. Days later, during another press conference, he crosses his arms when faced with uncomfortable questions. His voice rises half a tone. He interrupts the journalist, presses his lips as if trying to contain more than words. Beside him, Kate withdraws, always silent, always seeming smaller than before, and again the same pattern, firm speeches, rehearsed lines, but the eyes always speaking another language. There's no technical error there. There's calculation. But the body seems tired of maintaining the emotional charade. In another video, months later, Gerry talks about how the media has been cruel. And while he's right, because parts of the press crossed every line, the way he positions himself as a victim no longer convinces. It's as if little by little the mask had started to crack from the inside out. The original interview, that pause, that smile, that contradiction, now appears not as an isolated failure, but as a mirror of the public narrative, well crafted on the surface but full of cracks underneath, as if the truth was never denied with anger, but buried with sweetness. And that's what confuses the most, because if someone shouts, it's easy to suspect. But when someone says everything right in the right way with measured emotion, and still something feels off, then you realize the hardest lie to spot is the one told with calm, and maybe that's the one that hurts the most. The answer: no one wanted to hear 350 words. The detail that unsettles is the one that matters most, because that's where the unedited gesture lives. The fraction of a second when the unconscious steps out of line, where the truth doesn't scream. It just stumbles. And sometimes it's that stumble that reveals more than any forensic evidence. The interview doesn't prove anything, legally, but symbolically, it says everything. It says there was something unresolved in that grief. Something that didn't align with the fear of losing a daughter, but with the panic of being exposed. And even if it doesn't prove guilt, it shows conflict. It shows a man trying to seem too calm, a woman trying to disappear, and a silence between them that screamed for someone who was no longer there. People always look for grand evidence, but it's the small leaks that reveal more: a pause, a glance, a gesture out of place, a hand that doesn't reach the other. Freud would call it a slip, but maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's the soul trying to break free, saying, I can't keep pretending. That interview now becomes a symbol, not just of an unresolved case, but of a society that accepted too much, trusted too quickly, and preferred appearances over the discomfort of doubt. Gerry's slip became a metaphor, a mirror of what happens when a narrative is so well constructed that it forgets to leave room for the truth to breathe, and the truth that needs imperfections to exist. Maybe in the end, what unsettles us most about this case isn't what was said, but what was carefully rehearsed, because if even the grief seemed calculated, what else was? Maybe we'll never know what really happened that night, but we know what we felt watching that moment. And sometimes feeling is truer than knowing. What unsettles me most about all this? It's not Gerry's slip, it's not the gesture, the words, or the silence. It's the weight of what lies in the subtext, because there's something there that can't be explained with logic, only with presence. And those with that sensitivity notice. No caption needed. What we saw in that moment, in that crossed sentence, was what most people don't want to see. That the truth sometimes doesn't reveal itself in a shout, but in a stumble. That the body, even when trained, betrays what the mind tries to hide. And that the lens that captures is the same one that exposes. It's not about accusing, it never was. It's about perceiving, because there's a brutal difference between pointing a finger and holding a gaze. Those who accuse want to punish, those who perceive want to understand. And maybe that's why that moment was so uncomfortable, because it didn't scream guilt. It just showed that something was out of place, a crack in the veneer, a flaw in the script. And the unease didn't come from what was said, but from what was felt. It was there, in that brief sentence, in that strange pause, in that we showed the body said with the casualness of someone announcing dinner, that the ground gave way, a slip, a lapse, a mistake, but a human mistake, or a revealing one. That question No one will answer for us, and maybe they shouldn't, because the most important thing isn't what he said. It's what you felt hearing. What pierced you in that moment, that's what matters. It's as if that moment was stored like a forgotten note in the corner of the scene, too small to make headlines, but big enough to leave an unease that never fades. And if you felt that unease too, then you understood. You understood that not everything erased from official files vanished from collective memory. You understood that there are questions that were never asked, and for that very reason never answered. And you understood that silence sometimes is the loudest signal. I know, it's easier to believe the comfortable version, the polished, packaged one, backed by lawyers and technical language. It's easier to move on thinking it was just a mistake, a tragedy without culprits, an irreparable error. But what if it wasn't just that? What if the mistake wasn't just losing a child, but losing the chance to look bravely at what unsettles us? Gerry's slip isn't proof, but it's a giant question mark. And sometimes it's the question mark that moves everything, because it escapes control. It breaks the script, it lets the mask fall, even if just for a second. And it's in that second that the unease lives. It's in that second that the doubt lives. And it's in that second that the truth lives. Not the legal truth, not the official truth, but the one that burns and insists on staying. So if this video touched you, you don't need to write much, but leave a sign, a silent but symbolic response. Comment below, "I saw the slip." That simple phrase will tell me you were here, that you felt it, that you noticed. And if you want to go further, if you want to support this kind of content, if you want to keep this space alive investigating what so many prefer to forget, the Super Chat is there as a symbol, not as financial support, but as a badge of belonging. Those who send a Super Chat here aren't just helping the channel, they're saying, "I saw it too." They're saying, "This belongs to me too." They're saying, "Don't erase this," because there are files the system tries to seal, but collective consciousness insists on keeping open, and we're here for that, to look at what's been pushed into the dark, to hear what's been silenced, and to say what almost no one dares to say. Now, I want to know what this stirred in you. What was the moment that made you stop? That gave you chills? That made you think, something's wrong here? Write it in the comments. It can be just one line, but let it be real. I'll read every single one. And if you feel this kind of truth needs to keep being shown, if you believe in the importance of telling these stories with soul, without filters, without fear, then subscribe to the channel. Not because you need to watch more videos, but because we're still going to open other files, still going to listen to other silences, and still going to see other masks crack. The next video will show you exactly that, an answer that was never given, and that could change everything. Because while they try to close the curtain, we still have eyes to see what's left at the back of the stage, and not every slip is an accident. Sometimes it's the body screaming what the mouth can't say.